and welcome to an episode of the One India Talks in association with the National Indian Students and Alumni Union. My name is Ritika Abraham, and this is my colleague Abrar Aghotwala.
I am particularly excited for the guest we have on today because we at the One India Talks believe he is the true embodiment of a real luminary, an astute policymaker, an articulate leader, and a very senior advocate. This man has played a pivotal role in shaping modern India's economic policy. A former Union Minister of Finance and Home Affairs, a sitting member of the Rajya Sabha. Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me a warm pleasure to welcome to the LSE One India Talks, Shri P. Chidambaram. So thank you very much for being here with us today. I wanted to start off, sir, by discussing the presentation of the Union Budget presented by Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman. The government has touted this budget to be a groundbreaking one. Before we go into the details, broadly speaking, as a former finance minister yourself, what is your opinion on the provisions of this budget?
I have written and I've spoken several times on the budget. My overall impression is this budget does not do enough to revive the economic growth, nor does it do enough to address the issues of welfare, which are uppermost in the minds of millions of people who have lost their jobs, who have suffered pay cuts, who have had to close down their small and medium businesses, migrant workers, and a very large number of people who have suffered one way or another thanks to the economic slowdown of 24 months and the pandemic cum recession of last year.
Yes, sir. And I'm glad you brought that up because there have been prominent personalities such as the Nobel Prize winning economist Abhijit Banerjee who have argued that the country's economic growth has been slowing down as real GDP growth had weakened from 6.1% in 2018-19 to 4.2% in 2019-20. And all of this was before the pandemic hit us. In hindsight, having seen the new budget that's been presented, do you see these prospects changing?
No. The slowdown was pre-pandemic. We had cautioned them about the slowdown. I have written several essays on the slowdown. The slowdown started with 8.2% and ended in the 8th quarter with 4%. Therefore, the slowdown is visible. We had suggested corrective measures. No corrective measures were taken. The pandemic worsened the slowdown and it turned into a recession, minus 24.4% in the first quarter, minus 7.5% in the second quarter, and according to the government's provisional statistics, 0.4% in the third quarter. But this is provisional. And these are quarter upon quarter growth. It's like saying, how fast was your car running 4 years ago? If you look at it sequentially, actually, there has been a slowdown even in the third quarter. And the fourth quarter, which will end in about 20 days from today, I'm afraid will be an even greater slowdown. Therefore, there is no sign of revival at all. And unless they take corrective measures, they will not be able to revive the economy, which has touched the rock bottom.
Thank you for your answer, sir. So picking up on what you just said, privatizing 2 banks has been a big headline of this budget. Former RBI Governor Raghuram Rajan has said he hopes the government doesn't sell to big industrial houses because of the possible malfeasance that may occur when one can lend to one's own entity. In your opinion, is this an appropriate strategy?
We are not opposed to privatization. The question is, what will you privatize? We have said you can privatize chronic loss-making units. You can privatize units which have a very, very small market share and therefore add no value. And you can privatize units which have fallen way behind the technological change. Apart from these three, we are not in favor of privatization. We want the public sector to compete with the private sector. For example, they have announced that 2 public sector banks will be privatized. I ask why? In the last several years, we have given licenses to individuals to start private banks. So if there is another individual who is, quote unquote, fit and proper, who wishes to start a bank, give him a license and let him build a bank from scratch. Why hand over on a platter a ready-made bank? And let me tell you, they have already decided who will get the banks. They have already decided who will get the insurance company. They have already decided who will get the 7 airports. They will go through a formality, a charade of privatization, and hand it over to their favorite corporates.
So could you expand on the charade of privatization a bit?
Well, that's the experience of the last few years. Every port has gone to 1 or maybe 2 business houses. Every city distribution license of gas has gone to 1 or 2 corporate houses. So it's really no competition. You tailor the tender in such a manner that only a very few will qualify, and among the few who qualify, many will be simply frightened away from really participating in the tender.
Interesting. So
Thank you, sir. Moving slightly to the oil prices, during the pandemic, global oil demand saw a large dip. And according to a report by Bloomberg, the demand for oil in India also dipped by about 48% in April of 2020. However, even as we speak, the price of petrol in cities like Mumbai, New Delhi, and Bengaluru are above 90 rupees a litre and above 80 rupees a litre for diesel. In your opinion, why do you think this is the case?
Because this is daylight robbery. They can steal easily from poor and middle class who have no choice but to fill their cars, 2-wheelers, tractors with either petrol or diesel. What choice does an individual have? There's no choice. He has to go to work. He has to ply his trade. He has to carry on his business. He will, with very loud murmurs, fill his tank with petrol or diesel. And this is money straight to the pocket of the government. So it's the simplest way to tax, because every time somebody fills his or her tank with petrol or diesel, it's cash in the hands of the government. And they have increased the excise duties on petrol, gas, and cooking gas by almost 400% in the last 7 years. The excise duty component alone has been increased 400%. Take LPG. When the UPA government stepped down in April, May 2014, the price of a cylinder was 410 rupees. Last week, it was 820 rupees, exactly double. Far from doubling anybody's income, they have simply doubled the price of cooking gas.
And with all these expenditures continuously increasing, sir, and especially within the context of the COVID-19 pandemic and the government's response to helping the poor, an executive from JP Morgan Chase has argued that the government's efforts over the last 5 years has made India one of the best placed across the world to be delivering direct cash transfers. So following from this argument, if we have the infrastructural capability to be delivering these direct cash transfers, do you think it's been done at a satisfactory level already?
We have the infrastructure for direct cash transfer. In fact, it was started by the UPA government. You will remember in 2013-14, we started transferring cash, especially to ASHA workers, to scholarship receivers, scheduled caste, scheduled tribe, OBC. The scholarships were paid through direct cash transfer. So the direct cash transfer was started in the UPA and the infrastructure was put in place. The infrastructure has only become better. We called it direct benefit transfer, DBT. It has only become better in the last few years after refining the infrastructure. They are transferring cash. I do not say transfer cash to the poorest 50% of India, the bottom 50% of India. That is 13 crore families. They refuse to transfer cash. Therefore, fiscal stimulus will really come only when they transfer cash to the poorest families to tide over the consequences of the slowdown and the consequences of the pandemic.
Thank you, sir. Sticking with the same theme, sir, world economies suffered a crippling effect of the coronavirus in 2020. At such a time, governments the world over have focused on stimulating demand. Schemes have been focused on helping the most affected parts of the population. According to you, what has this Indian government done to stimulate demand?
None. They believe that supply side measures will take care of reviving the economy. Economist after economist, Abhijit Banerjee, you mentioned, Dr. Raghuram Rajan, a whole lot of them have said you have to stimulate demand by making fiscal transfers to the poor. This government has resolutely refused to do that, which is why the economy is still limping. There is no real pickup of demand. There is demand, no doubt, for necessities, for food items, but there is no demand for a wide variety of items which Indian industry, especially small and medium enterprises, produce.
Thank you for that, sir. But to probe that a little bit, do you think that the problems that affected India during the pandemic were inevitable due to the size of the nation? And how would you rate the central government's response when compared to other countries of India's stature?
What did the central government do? The pandemic came, the central government could not stop it. I didn't expect them to stop it either. Nobody can stop a pandemic. And the pandemic appeared to leave India. Again, the central government had no role in that. The pandemic continues to linger and the number of infections rise every day. So what has the central government done? The vaccines are the product of Indian and world scientists. The vaccine manufacturing capacity was installed many, many years ago. The Serum Institute has been there for several years, and these Hyderabad drug companies and pharma companies were all established many years ago. They have seized an opportunity to produce the vaccines. The government's role has been extremely limited. The government's role, in fact, is being questioned as riddled with shortcomings. Be that as it may, the blessing was that apparently Indians have a great degree of immunity. In fact, doctors have told me that there are very few COVID patients from slums. Remember, in Mumbai, the outbreak started in the Dharavi slum. But the first place in which the pandemic was contained, almost totally eliminated, was in the Dharavi slum. It is the lower middle class and the middle class which seem to have suffered greatly by the pandemic and the infection.
Thank you, sir. But there are figures from this global data intelligence firm called Morning Consult, which indicate that between 73% and 75% of the people in the country approve of Prime Minister Modi's handling of the situation. How would you respond to a figure like that?
Because they do not know what else could have been done. The pandemic is completely new to India. We have not had a pandemic in 100 years. So they don't have an alternative approach to compare it with. The lockdown was wrong. The sudden lockdown was doubly wrong. And imposing a sudden lockdown without cash transfers to the migrant workers triggered the most horrific humanitarian crisis in the last 57, 70 years. 4 crore people. Government admits to 1 crore. Private estimates put it at 3 crore to 4 crore people trekked along highways and railway lines to go back to their homes. Those horror stories were available on every media, television, Facebook, magazines, newspapers. Now, has the government owned responsibility for that horror story? It was the worst humanitarian crisis of any country that was affected by the pandemic. Have you heard of such mass reverse migration in Africa or any other Asian country? It happened only in India. People walked 300 kilometers, 400 kilometers, and the government simply turned its face against them until the Supreme Court intervened in the month of May. After 35 days of trekking, the Supreme Court intervened only in the month of May and compelled the government to run buses and trains to transport them back to their homes. This government was absolutely callous.
So it is very interesting that you say that, because in a piece written by the New York Times, and I'd like to quote from it, it says, "The tragic irony of Mr. Modi's lockdown inadvertently unlocked an exodus of tens of millions." And just as you were just saying, I'd like to ask, do you think that this is a logistical reality of the country because of its size, or could the untimeliness of the lockdown have been avoided and possibly avoiding the mass migration crisis?
Of course, the lockdown ought not to have been announced with just 4 hours notice. Overnight, people were homeless, roofless, jobless, incomeless, and foodless. They should have announced a lockdown. Even Singapore announced a lockdown with 5 days notice. And Singapore is only a large island. In India, you should have announced a lockdown with at least a week's notice and told people, if you want to go home, here are the buses and trains. They will transport you to Bihar, Uttar Pradesh, Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh, Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, the states where they came from. Avail of this opportunity and go back home. After 7 days, there will be a total lockdown. The great part of this untold human misery would have been avoided if they had done that. And then, after they reached home, there should have been a cash transfer to them. Without cash, I've said, if you go out of your home, you don't need cash. You can always earn cash. If you stay home, you need cash. Therefore, there should have been a cash transfer to the poorest families, the poorest 20% or poorest 30%. We suggested the bottom 50%. There should have been a cash transfer to the poorest 20 or 30%, at least for the first few months. And thirdly, the mountains of food grain. Why are they rotting there? The mountains of food grain, which farmers of India have produced and which the people have paid for, the food grain does not belong to the government. It belongs to the people of India. They've paid for procurement, they've paid for storage. That food grain should have been distributed to the poor people at least for 6 months until the jobs began to come back or they were able to find other sources of sustenance. They did nothing. No transport, no homes, no cash transfer, no food.
Segueing slightly into the more recent farmer agitation. So you have powerful economists such as Geeta Gopinath, who argue that the farm laws have the potential to increase the farmers' income. But on the other hand, one can clearly see the plight of the local farmers that had outpoured onto the streets of Delhi, clearly protesting the passage of the new farm laws. According to you, how does one reconcile the difference between economic expertise and on-the-ground experience?
Because, with great respect to the economists, they do not understand how the rural agricultural economy functions. The average holding in India is less than 2 acres. He has no surplus at all. If he has a surplus, it will be a surplus of a few bags of paddy, or a few bags of wheat, or a few bags of corn, maize. Now, let's take Maharashtra. The average distance between the farm and the nearest mandi is 25 kilometers. How does one expect the farmer to transport 10 or 12 bags of paddy 25 kilometers? Even the cost of transportation will eat the price. Therefore, by definition, and somebody has written a brilliant article today or yesterday, marketing will have to be local. There's no other way, except those who produce export quality rice like basmati. Marketing will have to be local for 86% of India's farmers. You will have to ensure that he gets a fair price at his farm gate. That is why the Congress manifesto announced, while the APMC must be reformed, the answer is not to abolish the APMC alone. The answer is to open thousands and thousands of markets in large villages and small towns. There should be a market within 3 to 5 kilometers of every farm. And if you must sell in that market, and you will get the MSP. That's the only way in which local production and local marketing can be combined with the economic theory that they should get a fair price. It can be done.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. One of the narratives around the farmers' protests centers around the liberalization of the Indian agricultural sector. However, this is touted to, like you said, decimate local farmers and the small-scale agricultural sector. The figure I have from a report by Reuters argues that nearly 85% of India's poor farmers own less than 2 hectares or 5 acres of land. And they find
1 hectare actually. The correct number is 1 hectare.
Okay, thank you, sir. And they find it difficult to directly negotiate with large buyers of farm produce. So do you think these protests end up becoming essential for them to reason with the government?
So what choice does a farmer have? What is the history of America? In the history of America, all the small farms were gobbled up by the large farms. That has helped America because 98% have moved away from agriculture into industry and services. And America has a population of 1/3 of India and a land size twice or thrice that of India. In India, the farm, the small farm, the miniature farm is the only asset which most farmers have. Many farm workers don't even have that asset. They are landless laborers. They are dependent upon the small farmer engaging them for seasonal labor. Now, if you want to encourage people to move away from farming, do so, but you must have jobs for them in the towns and cities. Where are the jobs? Yesterday's unemployment rate for urban unemployment is 20.5%. Where are the jobs? So what will happen if corporates enter the farm sector is that they will gobble up the farms. Yes, they may not be able to buy the farm today, but they will tie it up with leases, which is virtually owning the farm. And then they will consolidate. There will be less labor on farms. Mechanization is already there. Mechanization will gain rapid pace. What little jobs are available in farms will slowly begin to dwindle. Where will they go? Therefore, you have to understand the rural agricultural economy of India before you propose these textbook solutions.
Thank you, sir. We'd like to spend some time on the role institutions play in a democracy, starting specifically with the judiciary. In your opinion, has there been an increasing inclination of the judiciary towards the executive?
Well, the general impression is the judiciary has been more inclined to oblige the government. Now, that may be harsh judgment, but if that is the feeling among a very large section of the people that should raise danger signs. There have been some judgments which are controversial, which have gone in favor of the government. I don't question the integrity of that judgment, but the overall feeling is that they were very happy to oblige the government. Leave that aside. There are momentous issues which have not been decided. Demonetization took place in 2016. 9 questions were framed by Chief Justice Thakur. That case has yet to be heard. In the laws in J&K, dismembering Jammu and Kashmir into 2 union territories were passed on the May of 2020. Those cases have not been heard. There are cases challenging the indiscriminate invocation of the detention laws in Jammu and Kashmir. They have not been heard. Therefore, momentous cases of the one on electoral bonds has not been heard for 3 or 4 years. Now, why are these cases pending in the higher courts where they should have been heard haste post haste? So there are serious issues that are being raised. When it comes to the lower judiciary, the law was laid down many, many years ago and reiterated several times. Bail is a rule, jail is the exception. But here you find 21-year-old college students, 23-year-old trade union activists, journalists, a comic, a stand-up comedian who has not yet uttered the joke, all of them being thrown in jail. Why are they in jail? They should have been let off within hours of their arrest by the duty magistrate. Why are they in jail? In fact, there is a judgment of Justice Deepak Mishra which says every magistrate should ask himself a question. Does this case deserve police custody? Does it deserve judicial custody? Does it deserve any custody at all? The third question is never asked, rarely asked by a magistrate. They seem to think that it is automatic. When the police ask for custody, it's automatic to remand them to police custody for a maximum period of 15 days. At the end of 15 days, many magistrates believe that it is automatic that they should be sent to judicial custody. Why?
Yes, sir. Specifically speaking about the Citizenship Amendment Act, according to a legal correspondent with The Hindu, the CAA case came up just thrice in the past year in the Supreme Court. And this is despite 140 pleas, including one from a UN body. Some have argued that this has been due to lockdown disruptions. But in your opinion, is this similarly a sign of one institution bowing to executive pressure, or is it an inevitable reality of the Indian judicial system?
Those are your words.
Of course.
What I know is the government does not want these cases to be heard. The government's law officers find one excuse or another not to have these cases heard. In my view, the judges should ruthlessly reject such submissions and get on with the hearing of these cases. The CAA case is one such case. I listed 3 or 4, which are of great moment, which have very, very far-reaching consequences. These cases should be heard haste post haste.
Sticking with the importance of an independent judiciary, Mr. Chidambaram, seeing as one of the most preeminent judicial voices in India was considered for political office upon his retirement, and some have concluded that this involved some form of give and take. Would you agree with this? And if not, why?
Well, I can't use strong words, but it's clear that, in my view, and the view of many others, Mr. Ranjan Gogoi certainly did not qualify to be nominated to the Rajya Sabha. he has been nominated within weeks after his retirement. And just before his retirement, he delivered 5 judgments, all of which went in favor of the government. Now, there may be no one-to-one on that. You can't say this happened and therefore that happened. There may be no cause and effect. But the coincidence is so striking that there are suspicions. And when Mr. Gogoi took the oath of office in the Rajya Sabha, the first time in my many years in Parliament, the entire opposition booed him and walked out. It has never happened when a new member takes oath of office.
Thank you for that answer, Mr. Chidambaram. I also want to spend a little bit of time talking about the suggested absence of a strong opposition in India today. According to an article in the Financial Times, the striking feature of Indian politics today is the annihilation of a significant opposition. Do you agree that the BJP and Prime Minister Modi's government has majorly increased its foothold in India due to this argued absence?
That's a superficial observation. There is opposition to Mr. Modi. There is opposition in Kerala, Tamil Nadu, Telangana, Andhra Pradesh, Orissa, West Bengal, Punjab, Maharashtra, Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand. There is opposition. Why do you say there is no opposition? There is no national opposition to challenge Mr. Modi's sway in Parliament. But there are oppositions, very strong opposition in the states. So I think you have to keep in mind the distinction between the absence of a strong national opposition in Parliament and the presence of very strong opposition in the states. Mr. Modi's party rules only about 7 or 8 states in North India. There are 7 other states in North India which it does not rule. And in South India, they have one state, Karnataka. They did not win the election, they stole the election. Like they stole the election in Goa, Manipur, Arunachal Pradesh, Madhya Pradesh. They stole the government in Karnataka. In fact, there are 3 ways in which you can form or not form a government in India. You can win elections, you can lose elections, you can steal elections. And Mr. Modi, his party, has perfected the art of stealing elections.
So could you elaborate a little bit more on that?
170 MLAs of opposition parties have defected to the BJP in the last few years, which means what? There is a virtual market for MLAs and MPs. They are being bought and sold like cattle, and that's how governments change. In Goa, the Congress was the first party. In Manipur, the Congress was the first party. They deprived us of the right to form the government through the governors and form their own government by stealing our MLAs. They did that successfully in Madhya Pradesh, taking advantage of 23 people who betrayed the Congress party. They tried it in Rajasthan, they failed. They're doing it in Bengal today. They did it in Manipur. Let's take the Manipur example. 13 MLAs were sought to be disqualified. The governor referred the question to the Election Commission. The Election Commission gave its opinion in the month of October, November 2020. The Constitution says once the Election Commission gives its opinion after an inquiry about the disqualification of an elected legislator, MP or MLA, the governor is bound to act on that. This governor is sitting on that recommendation or decision for the last 3 months, because the Constitution only requires the governor to act on the recommendation. It does not require the governor to act within a certain number of days. So the governor is simply sitting on that decision. 3 months, the Congress party petitioned the President of India day before yesterday to direct the governor to take a decision on the recommendation of the Election Commission.
Sir, do you think part of the reason, and there have been suggestions in this regard, that that politicians defect from the Congress is because they no longer feel welcome there?
No, that's not correct. That may be correct in the case of a few candidates who were disappointed when they sought tickets for contesting an election. But most defections are people who have been elected. It's post-election. It's not the disappointed aspirer who is defected. Most candidates who have defected, most are MLAs and MPs. They have been elected. They cross over. Now, what do you call that?
Thank you, sir. Just staying with the idea of this oppositional party, it did take almost 2 years after the results of the 2019 general election for us to see an increased presence of Mr. Rahul Gandhi on the national stage. Would you argue that there is miscommunication or mismanagement within the senior Congress party leaders, and this has worked to the advantage of the BJP?
Mr. Rahul Gandhi tendered his resignation immediately after the result of the Lok Sabha elections. His resignation was not accepted for many months. When he insisted, reluctantly, the party accepted it. And after deliberations, since there's no viable candidate on the scene, we requested Mrs. Sonia Gandhi, to take over as interim president. Now, logically and naturally, the election of interim president should have been followed by an AICC meeting to elect a regular president. Now, I can't say who would have been a candidate, whether Mr. Rahul Gandhi himself would have been a candidate or not, I cannot say. That would be speculative. But before we could take up follow-up action to the appointment of an interim president, we had the pandemic. 2020 was washed out because of the pandemic. Now, in the beginning of 2021, we wanted to hold elections in the month of March, April, but the elections in 5 states have intervened. That's a second external event over which we have no control. So the party has now decided the elections will be held immediately after May 2, when the results of 5 state elections will be announced. So I'm confident that elections will be held towards the end of May or early June. And a regular Congress president will be elected. Yes, we have paid a price for not having a full-time Congress president, but that is because of external events and overwhelming change of circumstances.
So you say that it was due to external events, but would you not also argue that the absence of a clear and coherent strategy within the Congress party has led to the BJP and Prime Minister Modi taking advantage of the situation?
See, memories are short. When we won Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh, Chhattisgarh, and then at a different point of time, Jharkhand, Karnataka, we had a narrative. When we won Punjab, we had a narrative. When we won Goa, Manipur, and Arunachal Pradesh, we had a narrative. When we lose an election, the narrative disappears. What kind of a logic is that? The narrative is the same. The narrative is accepted by the people in some states. It is not accepted by the people in other states. So the lesson is you have to modulate or modify your narrative to make it state-specific narrative. We have now state-specific narratives in Kerala, Tamil Nadu, and Assam. Let us see what the elections will bring. They may bring us victory, they may not bring us victory. But we have state-specific narratives in Kerala, Tamil Nadu, and Assam.
Thank you, sir. And speaking of the upcoming Tamil Nadu elections, the Congress has been seen campaigning extensively within the state. Are we to expect a stronger performance as a result of these campaign efforts on the part of the Congress?
I hope so. I was disappointed when we won only 8 out of 41 seats in the last assembly elections, and we won only 5 out of 63 seats in the previous assembly elections. So I have been telling my colleagues, it's not the number of seats you contest, it's the number of seats you win, which matters. So please be more careful in choosing the constituencies that you will contest, and please be doubly careful in choosing the candidates you will contest. But if we make a wrong choice of constituencies and a worse choice of candidates, we will lose. So it is an internal exercise that we have to do. We have to correct ourselves internally, that we choose only that number of constituencies where we can find viable, successful candidates, contest in those constituencies and maximize our strike rate. In Bihar, our strike rate was very poor compared to Mr. Tejasvi Yadav's strike rate. In the last election in Tamil Nadu, our strike rate was very, very poor compared to the DMK strike rate. So the most important thing is not in the number of seats we contest, but in what seats we contest and with what candidates we contest.
As we come to the last few questions of this interview, sir, we wanted to focus on around our main theme of India in 2022 at 75 years of independence.
And as we look to 2022, is the India that we see around us today one that was imagined or envisioned by the first Prime Minister of our country? And if not, what needs to change?
Certainly not. Freedom is diminished in India today, and I have written extensively about it. Tax laws are oppressive. Tax administration is intrusive. Investigating agencies have been suborned by the government to do their dirty work. The harassment and persecution of opposition political parties and political leaders continues unabated. Every voice of dissent is named as seditious, and serious criminal charges are slapped against activists, writers, poets, cartoonists, students. They're all in jail. Police excesses in JNU and ANU were gross. The entire media, or practically the entire media, is tamed. There are very few voices of protest in the media today. And now they're trying to control the social media and OTT platforms. Freedom has been diminished in this country in the last 7 years, and particularly in the last 4 years, which is why in the Human Freedom Index, or the Freedom House Index, or the VDEM, whatever, every one who's been ranking countries on freedom has lowered India's rank. One sees it every day in daily life. The pervasive mood is fear. Nobody will speak today against the government. Industrialists, bankers, academics, they're scared to speak. In a country where the ruling sentiment is fear, the ruling quality is fear, how do you call it a free country? We are a very much diminished democracy today.
Thank you, sir. And as a senior politician, what advice would you give young Indians the world over who would like to join politics in order to make a difference?
The question is, where do they want to join politics? Indians world over, by definition, means they are citizens of many countries. And I wish them well in whichever country they've chosen as their home. If I was in Sweden or Denmark, I would encourage young people to join politics because they're the freest countries in the world. But if you are a student in China, I certainly would not ask you to join politics, because if you utter a word against the Communist Party, you will probably spend the rest of your life in jail. In India today, the threat to free speech is real. The threat to freedom of expression is real. If you want to join politics in India, you must be prepared to face these threats, harassment, and persecution. Unless you are brave enough to, and hard enough and strong enough to face harassment and persecution, you cannot join politics in India. Politics is not smooth sailing in India. You are battling not a political party. You're battling a well-honed machine which is trying to take control of all institutions in India. It's the RSS. The BJP only happens to be the political arm of the BJP, of the RSS. There are many other arms. The ABVP is an arm, the trade union BMS is an arm, the Vivekananda Kendras are an arm. They have several arms. With all these arms, if I may call them tentacles, they want to take over the entire country and every institution in the country. You have to fight that machine. If you have the steel in you to fight that machine, come and join politics in India.
Thank you very much for your answers, Mr. Chidambaram. We at the One India Talks were keen on an engaging and intellectually stimulating discussion, and so you gave us just that. Thank you for your candor and your quick-witted responses. On behalf of the London School of Economics and LSE SU South Asia Society, we want to extend our warmest thank yous to Shri P. Chidambaram for coming to speak to us today.
Thank you.
And we'll be back next week for another episode of the One India Talks, for some more real talk with another real luminary. Thank you for watching.